Welcome back. In part 2, Marco and I switch gears and talk about why Satan plays such a large role in heavy metal music. We then shift the discussion to why some people think that occultism leads to fascist and Nazi ideologies. And although I was a bit mixed up with my questions, some important points came out of this in the end. Lastly, we talk about Marco's own essay that discusses how sex is actually a very important aspect for some esoteric practitioners. So let's move on now to Kenneth Granholm's essay called Why All That Satanist Stuff in Heavy Metal, wherein he asks more specifically, why all that Satan stuff in heavy metal? Granholm discusses how heavy metal's predecessors, blues and rock, were considered the devil's music, and goes a bit into the problems that rock bands have had with regard to accusations of being satanic. One brief reference that Granholm makes is to the band Judas Priest. And here we have a pop culture reference in the trial against this band, who were accused of hiding harmful subliminal messages in their music recordings. And if you'll allow me just to give a brief recap for the listeners with context about this trial. In 1985, two young men in the state of Nevada in the United States had been drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana, listening to music, including Judas Priest's Stained Glass LP for around 6 hours. Unfortunately, both men shot themselves with shotguns, and one died immediately. The other was seriously disfigured and died 3 years later. The parents of the men sued Judas Priest for damages, claiming that the two young men were brainwashed into suicidal actions. The accusation, supported by fundamentalist Christian groups such as Dial the Truth Ministries in 1990, that the band used backward masking to hide commands or tributes to the devil in the song lyrics, was made, along with the claim that this promoted Satanism. Another good example of this is with the Led Zeppelin song Stairway to Heaven, where the phrase, "Here's to my sweet Satan," is just a part of a longer text that is allegedly praising Satan. And I'll supply the links in the podcast notes for those who would like to look into this a little bit more deeply. So one must listen to the music backwards to hear these messages, but there are those like David John Oates who claim that the backward messages can be picked up by the subconscious mind. Now, however, let's go back to the trial. Testimony showed that the two men were both from dysfunctional families that included domestic violence and child abuse. Both had dropped out of high school, had job issues, etc. And all of this information shed light on the fact that the young men were most likely quite troubled due to an array of other factors. So in the end, the judge ruled the band not responsible for the men's actions. Now, while it can't be denied that bands use references to the devil or hell or to people well known in the occult milieu, such as Aleister Crowley, Granholm highlights that most of these references were not satanic in nature at all, but were used as an allegory to reference other things. The one exception in the essay that he states is Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, who bought Crowley's Bullskin House and who was very interested in Crowley's teachings. But for this discussion, can you talk more about why blues, rock, and heavy metal are seen as being so dangerous to society, and more specifically, why the figure of Satan or demons or other occult references are found in heavy metal music?
Well, first of all, I think it is important to place that story into a broader context, because especially the story of Judas Priest's trial has to do with a particular climate that existed in the U.S.
Definitely.
And this has to do with Satanic Scare period. So this is something that began to develop in the 1970s, reached its height in the 1980s. That was really the high moment, and then died out in the 1990s. And this Satanic Scare was actually based on the idea that there were satanic conspiracies, so satanic groups that were being active. They were organizing all sorts of horrible things in the dark. They would kidnap people, especially children. They would rape them. They would organize all sorts of evil rituals, including orgies, all sorts of sex and human sacrifice and these kind of things. Now, this was based on psychiatric theories that have been long discredited, in fact. And in fact, this in itself was also part of a broader context of reaction to the spreading of new religious movements at the time. So this was related also to the idea of brainwashing, the idea that your brain can be washed. So that's also a theory that has been completely discredited. It has no scientific basis whatsoever. So, in fact, this is part of a history that, I think is long gone to a certain extent. And in fact, even, the idea that you can put secret messages, backward messages that you can only hear on a vinyl, if you play it backwards, it's something that, I think most young people don't even understand what it means, because obviously, young people don't have vinyls today, so they cannot play things backwards.
Well,
so
that's not entirely true.
It's not true.
Vinyl is making a comeback. It is making a comeback.
Yeah, maybe for old people, but I don't know that young people are buying so many vinyls. I don't know if you know them. I don't think I know many people who have a
I know
turntable
a few young people who are buying vinyl.
Are they playing them also backwards?
I can't attest to that, but I know that they're buying them.
Anyways, whether you can play them backwards or not, it's clear that the theory on which this was based had no scientific basis whatsoever. It has been long discredited. Mm-hmm. So that's really, I think, the most important thing that we have to keep in mind. On the other hand, it is true that you do find all sorts of references to this kind of material related to Satan or Satanism in this kind of music. But I think we always have to keep in mind that, in fact, we are also dealing with a scene that has some degree of commercialism. So that, in fact, these groups, in some cases, but as Kenneth Granholm points out very correctly, these are actually the exceptions. In some cases, some of these groups may have a real interest in esotericism or in satanic material. So there might be a sincere, desire, in fact, to express ideas that one can find, in a particular tradition or literature that has to do with Satanism, or even more generally with darker forms of esotericism. And in fact, in many cases, this is more for the show. In fact, a certain way of dressing yourself, of creating a particular public image, references in the lyrics of the songs, the visual elements that you have in the sleeves, in the covers of the records, which nowadays are even less important. Again, well, less for people who still cling to vinyls, but in the past, you really had this object, the vinyl, the 33 LP, round LP, which it was part of of the culture, of the music culture itself. You would have images, you would have photographs, or even artworks that would be there, and they would be part of the message that the band or the artist was trying to convey. But for this material, there is an audience, and the audience has some expectations. So you are part of a genre, you are part of a particular style, and you have to conform to it. So you have to respond to what the expectations of the audience are. So I would say that to a significant extent, what we find there in this kind of music discourse relates to that, in fact, and that the other thing is actually the exception. So even all these preoccupations, this kind of panic, this moral panic that existed back then, not only didn't have any scientific basis, but it was totally misplaced because, in fact, in many cases, what you find there is actually, half serious. It's actually sometimes a bit ironic also. You have to read it in a second degree. And this is something that very often the audience itself was very much able to do. And it's not necessarily the case that the typical audience of this kind of bands or this kind of artists would, take all these things at the superficial level and believe everything that these people would say. They certainly enjoy the music, but when it comes to the message, well, I'm not sure that they would actually follow anything that is there. And again, I would like to emphasize another point, with respect to the Judas Priest story. But I mean, there are quite a few examples of this. Again, let's say in very general terms, what society or what a certain portion of society wanted to do there was to find very, very easy answers. So you would not look at the social background of these persons. You would not look at what caused the problems that these persons had. You would not try to find answers to these problems, to social injustice, for instance, inequality, discrimination, these kind of things. No, you would actually put the finger on rock music, on heavy metal. That's ridiculous.
So it becomes a scapegoat, an easy scapegoat.
Yeah, and that's a very common social dynamic. It's not even modern. Actually, you find it right. In all periods, in all places. It's neither modern nor Western. Actually, it's scapegoating, which is probably a very human reaction to situations of stress, situations of where you don't find an answer, or you are not able to develop a complex answer to a complex problem. Well, then the answer is just putting the finger on the weakest and most fragile thing that happens to pass by at that moment.
Right, and the devil seems to be an easy scapegoat in this instance, then, with regards to the heavy metal music.
Yeah, but I have to say, I mean, Kenneth Granholm is right in his essay, because he points out that, in fact, this was also done, and intended as a provocation. So that, in fact, the antinomian, so to speak, or the kind of provocative element was done, was there with a purpose. In fact, these people wanted to shock. They certainly were against certain social conventions. So it was not, maybe I put it a bit too strongly earlier. It was not just about commercialism. It was not just responding to the fantasies of a certain audience. In fact, there was also a certain kind of social discourse there that is particularly interesting. So promoting an alternative, a radically alternative vision, of society, for instance, something that goes against the grain. And then you understand, okay, then it makes sense also that society, mainstream society or the establishment would respond to that, it would respond to the provocation. So, it's a very interesting dynamic in itself.
And if it's considered provocative and a statement against perhaps a majority way of thinking about something, then the devil in this case fulfills that adversary role very well.
Absolutely. I mean, you see this also in literature. You see this in Milton. Paradise Lost. You find it in Lucifer as a romantic hero. Mm-hmm. It's not a coincidence that when Madame Blavatsky creates the Theosophical Society and then wants to found a periodical, he calls it Lucifer. Why? Because it shows that there is something about, exploring, a radically alternative vision of reality and perhaps also of society. And this connects so well with the figure that has been considered by mainstream Christians and, I would say by Christians generally, as the adversary, as the enemy. Mm-hmm. So we want to be on the other side.
Right, right. So Granholm does mention that one particular subgenre called black metal, or as it was later called ritual black metal, does attest to be involved with occult practices and does self-identify as being satanic. I was wondering if you could explain a bit about how this type of thinking does connect to esoteric or occult groups. If you can say anything about that.
Well, as I was saying, I mean, in fact, we are dealing with a landscape, a scene that is extremely diverse. And it's certainly very problematic to generalize and to say, okay, it's all fake, it's only for the show. And no, in fact, there are groups, and Kenneth Granholm mentions them, describes them, where the interest for certain practices, for certain ideas, is actually sincere. From what you can tell, it seems like that the people who are involved in these groups are not just interested in a purely commercial or even artistic discourse per se, because it could also be an artistic discourse that is not necessarily pushing it in the commercial direction. Mm-hmm. But still not necessarily interested in the esoteric side of things. No, where you actually see a deeper involvement. And the interesting thing is that in some cases with these groups, by the way, the groups that kind of Granholm talks about are mostly from the Scandinavian or Nordic area. So that's interesting in itself. I mean, this is a phenomenon that has a following, that has an audience elsewhere, but in terms of groups, it has developed particularly in that area, in that region. And the interesting thing is that in some cases you can see how some of these groups, how some of these bands are actually connected to real esoteric groups, that there is a kind of almost like an overlap or certainly a strong connection between these. So you can see, well, in that case, okay, it's not a joke. It's not just for fun, but there is something more there.
Mm. Okay, well, thanks for going more in depth about Kenneth's essay. Let's move on now to Julian Struber's essay, Doesn't Occultism Lead Straight to Fascism? And this idea is so widespread, and references to it are found just about everywhere. And my popular culture references, here we come again, comics such as Hellboy, that was later made into films. Another film, Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's just to name a few of these cultural references. So there's this idea that seems to be everywhere. And this topic alone could be its own podcast series. And there's a lot to take in when one reads this essay. But just for the sake of this discussion, to try to keep things quite straightforward, I'd like to ask you and focus on the questions. 1, why are Nazis associated with the occult? 2, who came up with this accusation? And is there any truth to it? And 3, how did this idea become so widespread?
Yes. Well, it's a complicated story. It's a complicated story. So Julian Strube made a wonderful job in trying to disentangle the different aspects of this story. So I think, first of all, in the title, you don't find Nazism, you find fascism. So that's an interesting point, and it's not necessarily a small detail, because traditionally now fascism refers not only to the political movement that emerged in Italy in the interwar period, but more generally to a political phenomenon that was present in Europe and also outside of Europe. And it still is today. So in different forms, in different contexts, but that still has some commonality. So it can still be brought back to this umbrella term of fascism. Whereas Nazism usually really refers to, the German political movement that emerged also in the same period, interwar period in Germany. So why is this distinction important? It is important because there are actually 2 different claims that can be made. And they actually have different relevance for our discourse. Okay. So the first one would be fascism generally, as a certain kind of political phenomenon that has to do with the rejection of democracy, with the rejection of generally of democratic values. It's based on the idea of dictatorship. It's very often based also on ideas of discrimination against particular groups, and so on and so forth. So that this is connected to esotericism, that there is a kind of structural, phenomenological connection between fascism and esotericism. Now, that's actually a very broad claim. And it's not the same thing as saying Nazism, the historical movement and party that took shape in Germany in the interwar period was related to occultism. That's a more specific thing, right? Because it relates to one particular episode, to one particular movement, to particular persons, whereas the former claim is much broader, and it's a claim that has been made by quite a few authors. It has been made by Theodor Adorno, the famous German philosopher. It has been made by Umberto Eco, Italian intellectual of international reputation, now also dead. So the idea that in fact there is something inside of fascism and something inside of esotericism that somehow makes the 2 connect. This has to do with ideas about irrationalism, that in fact fascism is often connected to irrationalism, and because esotericism is also irrational, then the 2 must go together, and so on and so forth. So this kind of ideas. Now, this idea obviously is weak. This claim is weak. Why is it weak? It's weak because it doesn't stand the test of the historical record. Now, if you look back and analyze the many forms that esotericism has taken throughout history, going back to ancient times, you realize that there is no simple political equation of esotericism. When it comes to translating esotericism politically, you can have all sorts of different positions. You can have progressive, liberal attitudes. You can have reactionary, conservative attitudes. So you have very, very diverse, complex situation, and it's just impossible to make a kind of linear connection between esotericism and one particular political option. This is just, historically, it's just not true. It doesn't take too long, in fact, once you start looking a little bit closer at the historical record to realize that, and if you look especially at the 19th century, what you find in terms of movements in the 19th century and even early 20th century, you realize that most of these movements actually were more on the progressive liberal side than on the conservative side. Right. So clearly that kind of very, very broad claim is really untenable as far as I am concerned, the way I understand it, and also the way Julian Strube understands it. Now, if we talk about the other claim, the more specific claim, the connection between Nazism and occultism, that's a different story, of course, because there, in fact, the connection really existed, and it's difficult to deny it. Perhaps the complication is trying to determine the extent of this connection. So how deep really this connection was. And on this problem, in fact, there is already quite a large literature. It's not something that has not been studied. And there, I would make a different kind of distinction that is quite important, because on this subject, there is on the one hand serious scholarly literature that starts as far back as at least the 1960s, I would say, with George Mossy. And that has a very important moment in the 1980s with Nicholas Goodrich Clark, who published a very important book, originally his PhD dissertation on the occult roots of Nazism. And to a certain extent, this was really the book that, in a certain sense, set the record straight. So that really analyzed what was true and what was more mythical in this connection between Nazism and occultism. Now, of course, there was a lot more work to be done, and it was not possible for Goodrich Clark to cover the whole of the subject. So, in fact, there is still work to be done there. But this was serious scholarship. And Julian Strube, of course, who is the author of the essay, has contributed also very importantly to this discourse, but quite a few other scholars are doing that. So that's one aspect. But then there is another literature, form of literature that has developed that presents itself as being non-fictional. So, but it's also not scholarly. It doesn't want to say that it's based on fiction. It doesn't say that it's myth, that it's legend, but still it is actually fictional because it's based on speculations, on unfounded hypotheses, and so on and so forth. So this is actually the literature of Nazi occultism. This begins also in the 1960s with a very famous book that was published in the very early 60s, and it was titled The Dawn of the Magicians, Le Matin des Magiciens.
I think in English it's called The Morning of the Magicians. The book I have has The Morning of the Magicians.
Yeah, you're right, yeah. The Morning of the Magicians. And in this book, you actually already had all the points that were later developed by this literature. So all these kind of fantasies and hypotheses, which were actually interesting. They certainly were fascinating, but they had no historical basis. So. Yeah. Actually, they didn't explain anything, but rather they complicated, they obfuscated the historical record. So this is a literature that has developed considerably over the years. It was particularly visible in the 1970s, 1980s, in France, in the UK. And it's clear that, if it had this kind of success, it's because it had an audience. So these kind of subjects always attract a particular audience. Yeah. It's clear that when you have an audience, you have people who are going to, to use that opportunity, to write something that can sell.
Right.
Okay. So I think that today we are in a better position, I think, to make the difference between what is historically validated, what is historically real, and what is more on the side of invention and fantasy. So, to conclude, in fact, there was such a connection between Nazism and occultism. This connection, in fact, was much smaller than people have tended to think or have liked to think. There were quite a few persons in the Nazi party, even at the top of the Nazi movement and party, who were interested in these kind of subjects. Rudolf Hess, Heinrich Himmler, for instance, they were certainly interested in this kind of stuff. There were others who were not so interesting. Hermann Goering, for instance, couldn't care less, quite honestly. Right. And even Hitler himself, it turns out that, there are a few hints here and there that maybe he had read, certain literature that is, somehow related to Ariosophy and this kind of stuff. But actually, he was too much of a realist politician to give really too much importance to this kind of stuff. He could play, perhaps, with this kind of stuff in order to create a certain image of the Nazi Party, which was actually successful, because he also had to deal with his own audience. The whole paraphernalia, these references to an ancient Nordic Germanic past. I mean, this was a construction that hit a spot on the imaginary of the German people at the time, or a portion of the German people at the time. But that he believed in this kind of stuff, that's not very likely.
Well, I'm glad that we're talking about this, because one of my goals as well with this podcast is to talk about misconceptions. And I think that there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding this topic, especially within popular culture, that Hitler was a member of the Thule Society and was involved in occult rituals. I mean, there's all types of stories, but as you pointed out, with particular fictional literature that poses as nonfiction, it's an easy scenario that people are going to not understand what's really going on, because they're not privy to all of the historical information. So I think that's why it's important for historians to step in and say, wait a minute, we've got something else going on here. But I think that's clearly a lot.
Yeah, that's clearly our mission, and I think this is also in part what we wanted to do with Hermes Explains, in the sense that we wanted to give information that is reliable about subjects that usually people wonder about. They ask themselves this question. So also the general public, they have this thing about fascism and esotericism, in their ears. And then they say, oh, well, there must be something true there, right? So, it's important for us to, as a kind of social mission, so to speak, to make these kind of distinctions and to explain, okay, well, this makes sense historically. This makes a bit less sense historically. And this is completely crazy, actually. You can just forget about it.
Right. So I think that's a very good thing. So thank you for explaining that. So now I've saved the best for last, and that's your essay. And that deals with the question, but what does esotericism have to do with sex? So I think everybody's ears...
But because it's sex, right?
Everyone's ears are going to prick up right now. We're like, oh, what, sex? I think that this probably is a topic that not many lay people know about, or if they have heard about esotericism and sex, they might think of Tantra, but as your essay explains, it's much more than just that. You list 4 ways that sex is actually a very important aspect in esoteric practice and thought. Could you briefly go through these aspects and explain what these are?
Yes. Well, obviously, the relationship between sex and esotericism is actually quite complex, and it was impossible in this short space because obviously we also had limitations with respect to the space that we had at our disposal. So obviously you could not really cover everything in depth, and also this was not really the intention from the beginning. But at least I wanted to show how diverse and complex this relationship is, and I think there are these four aspects. The first aspect is the idea that, in fact, eros, understood here as, sexuality in general. So eros, of course, is the Greek word for sex or love, or, it actually covers different, it's not, perfectly translatable into our modern languages, but that eros is, in fact, a kind of key to understanding how the universe functions. That it's one of the core aspects of the universe, and it's a kind of let's say law of how the universe functions, and it's based on the law of attraction. Of course, that eros is how things are attracted to each other, not just human beings, but also everything that exists in the universe, as if the universe was like a very big organism, big living being that is also moved by passions and emotions, and that things that are within this are also attracted to each other in very special ways. So this idea is an idea that originally you find in Plato, that has its own history by itself, and then we find it back in very important authors of Western esotericism in the early modern period, in the Renaissance, like Marsilio Ficino, for instance, or Giordano Bruno. And it's clear that this idea of eros as one of the main aspects of reality has a lot to do with magic also, because magic is a technique that allows you to understand how this law of attraction functions, and if you understand how it functions, then you are able to act on it and to manipulate reality. For instance, to make things happen, but especially also to bind people to you, to bind objects to you. This is especially what you find, for instance, in Bruno, in some of his treatises that he wrote about magic. The Vinculis is a very famous one. So it's about binding. How do you bind people? Yeah, you bind them also by understanding how this law of attraction functions. The second aspect is the use of sexual symbolism. So in esoteric literature, you often find, in fact, the use of sexual symbolism. And this happens not just at the textual level, but also at the visual level. If you think about alchemy, this is something that happens quite frequently, actually. So obviously, many manuscripts and alchemical texts have a very important visual component. You have images there, and some of these images are sexually connotated. So you have sometimes even the image of a sexual intercourse, for instance, or you have, images that somehow have a sexual element in them, like the androgyne, this figure that has both masculine and feminine aspects into one single being. So obviously, this kind of images or this kind of references that also come back then in the textual part of this tradition can be understood metaphorically. So they refer to, in the case of alchemy, to particular processes, to particular moments of transformation. So the sexual intercourse may refer. You may find, for instance, the intercourse of a king and the queen. What does it stand for? Well, it can refer, for instance, to the union, to the bringing together of two different metals or two different substances. So that would be the explanation. But all these metaphors and all these images can be read at different levels, you see. So it can refer to actual substances, actual metals, but maybe it also refers to something else. Maybe it's a key to understanding also other kind of secrets and mysteries, you see. So this is something that you find. So this sexualized language is something that you find quite often in esoteric literature. It's something that comes back. Then the third aspect is the use of magical practices in order to deal with problems that have to do with the sexual sphere. And this is something that you find especially in popular forms of magic. So things related, for instance, to sexual potency, women who are not able to become pregnant, or people who, want to break up the relationship of somebody else because they want to, be with one of the persons involved in this relationship. So all sorts of things related to the sexual sphere may be the object of particular magical practices, or also other forms of esoteric practices. And so in this case, they are not so much, the subject of the practice, but the object of the practice, because the practice itself may not be particularly sexual in itself. The target, the goal of the practice is sexual, but not necessarily the practice itself, the technique that you are using in itself. And then the fourth aspect, the fourth way in which sex and esotericism can be related to each other is a modern development in the history of Western esotericism, and it is the emergence of what we call sexual magic. And this is actually the use of sexual intercourse, of sex, as esoteric practice. So in this case, it's not so much about the intended goal of the esoteric practice, but it is actually the technique itself that becomes sexualized. So you actually use sex as part of the magical or esoteric practice. This is something modern. It emerges, as I said, in the 19th century, in the West, of course, in let's say, especially in a Christian context. Because if you go in other cultures, then you may find sexual practices that are associated with all sorts of spiritual meaning. You have it in China, for instance, with Tao. You have it in India with Tantra. You know, these are traditions that go back much further in time. Whereas in a Western context, it appears to be something a bit more recent. This is controversial, perhaps, to some. Some other scholars may have different ideas. They refer, perhaps, to examples in Gnosticism. They refer to other examples, more recent examples in 18th century Freemasonry, whatever. Honestly, I am a bit skeptical. And until now, I fail to see any hard evidence of real, actual sex being used in these kind of practices. Many often, what we see is that there is a literature projecting particular sexual practices onto other groups. You know, they are claiming that particular groups are using these practices, but this is not in the first person. This is usually something that is said in order to stigmatize other people, you know, and cast them in a negative light. So, and this is precisely what is being done with the Gnostics, you know, by the Church Fathers, by early Christian writers. But this is something that, you know, in the context of stigmatization of particular religious minorities, religious groups, it's something that you find very, very often. So the idea is that these groups, you know, they meet secretly and they engage in all sorts of bestial, horrible sexual practices. It's something that comes up again and again. But whether this is really true, whether there is any, you know, hard evidence that this really happened, this is the question. And to be honest, before the 19th century, I failed to see any real evidence for that.
staying on this aspect, the fourth aspect of the sex magic, why is this this aspect so important to esotericists? So if we're not trying to make them out to be obscene and the like, but that people who are actually wanting to use this, why is that important in this modern context?
Well, first of all, I would say that it is important to some esotericists and not to all of them, because sexual magic is not something that is being practiced by everybody.
Correct.
And I would say that if you probably if you take the whole esoteric landscape of the 19th and 20th century, well, it's hard to make statistics, but I would rather tend to believe that the practice of sexual magic remains an exception. It's not something that is practiced by everybody, right. Although it is also true that it's practiced more than we would think, because sometimes people do practice it, but then they don't say it. They are being discreet about it because they are afraid precisely of the stigma that might be attached to it. So there is a lot of research that still has to be done on this. Anyways, for some esotericists, it was certainly very, very important. Not only just important, but the key of everything. If you take the case of Aleister Crowley, that I have studied a bit, it's clear that for Crowley, starting from a certain moment in his life, there is no more efficacious thing than the practice of sexual magic. This is a discovery that he makes at a certain point, and it becomes really the overarching method that he uses from that moment on for himself. This is what he practices himself. This is what puts as the most important secret. Actually, it's not even him who puts it as the most important secret, because at some point he becomes a member of a group where the secret is theoretically already there. And this is where he learns it himself, but he becomes part of this discourse, and he also claims that in fact this is the most important esoteric practice that you can have. There is no more important practice than this. Okay, so why is this so? Well, I think that it has to do with the fact that sex is a very powerful thing. It's a very powerful thing. Psychologically, socially, it's clear that it releases a certain kind of power. We might call it emotional, we might call it psychological, whatever. But it's clear that there you have a reservoir, so to speak, of energy that becomes available when people use it. And I'm not talking about the let's say the subtle energy or the spiritual energy. I'm not making any claim at that level, but I'm really talking about the psychological energy, the emotional energy that is really there. So I think that the moment people starting to use this, to realize that this was an available option for esoteric practice, but people realized that for them, this was really working. This was really, meaningful, and it made sense. It made total sense to them. As I said, again, the fact that there is such a sensitive aspect in the use of sex, that sex has been, associated with stigma also, makes it easy to understand why then it is also so powerful. It's again the power of fascination. Yeah. Things that are forbidden, things that are hidden, immediately become interesting. They acquire a certain kind of power just because of that, just because they're forbidden. Indeed. And other people don't want to touch them. Say, oh, you know what? Yeah, I am going to do it. So that's for people who don't like conventional things, that want to go for a more antinomian kind of perspective. And Crowley obviously belongs to that category. It's certainly the typical guy who wants to do the different thing, wants to do the other thing. It's clear. So I think that certainly it has to do with that. And then I don't know that this has been really, investigated so much, but we certainly have come to realize now that esotericism is historically very much related to altered states of consciousness. So this is something that, it was even the general theme of the S3 conference last year here in Amsterdam. Now, if this is true, it is also true that orgasm is a fantastic way and an easy way. It's normally it's actually an easy reach for most people to achieve an altered state of consciousness. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think that in fact that kind of energy, the perceived energy that you can receive from that moment, of exaltation. Which can easily be related to, a mystical experience in a certain sense. Well, it's clear that from there to the moment in which you would start to see the magical potential of this, I think the step was actually quite short. And many esotericists have taken it.
Very interesting. You also mentioned that the United States plays an important role in this type of magic. And why is that?
Well, that's an interesting thing, because I think there is a widespread idea that the use of sex for magical purposes and, in the context of Western esotericism actually emerged in Europe. And this is a bit of a misapprehension, because I think that, in fact, if you look at the beginning of this, there are quite a few authors who were actually in the US. And the very first one, the one who really formalizes the use of sex in an esoteric context, in a magical context, is actually Pascal Beverly Randolph, who is an American spiritualist. So it's clear that the US in the 19th century offered kind of fertile soil for the emergence of this particular discourse and also for these particular practices. And so I tried to wonder why this was the case. And I think that this has to do with the fact that the United States, certainly in the 19th century, were a much more mobile and flexible social environment. So that, in fact, religious diversity was certainly much easier there were religious persecutions and all sorts of, difficult moments also for this religious diversity in the US, but certainly compared to the situation at the time in Europe, it was certainly possible to experiment with all sorts of alternative beliefs and alternative ideas. It is not a coincidence that spiritualism, which is incredibly innovative, radically innovative in the religious field, it's something that comes from the US, and you have a large number of new religious movements that are originated also in the US in the 19th century, the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so on and so forth. So this points to the fact that the US offered perhaps a more favorable environment for the emergence of and for the practice of these ideas. Certainly, this has to do with the fact that in that period, even the control, the political control and social control of the government, of the federal government, was actually limited, and there were huge portions of territory that, were still being colonized at the time. So, in fact, suppose you were being persecuted in one place, you would move further west. You see, and then you would find yourself a place where you would be free to do whatever you liked. And that's exactly what the Mormons did, by the way. Mm-hmm. You see? So I think that's clearly the reason why, it is, especially in the United States, that this particular discourse related to the use of sex in esotericism emerged and developed. And let's not forget also other communities that are loosely related also to esotericism that were also engaging with all sorts of sexual experimentations, like the Oneida community, for instance. So clearly in the US, it was possible to do things that, for Europe would come perhaps a bit later.
Right. Fascinating stuff. I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk about these essays and your essay also. I find this to be very interesting material to talk about, but it's not the type of material that you would just normally, you wouldn't strike up a conversation with somebody about sex magic, generally speaking. So
why not?
Why not? Yeah, I guess
I do it all the time.
Well, okay, so maybe that's my problem then. Okay, but in any case, that I have the opportunity now to strike up a conversation about it, I really appreciate that. Thank you for talking about this really special book, and I hope that this discussion has made people interested to go out and read it for themselves. So again, thank you for making the time to talk with me today.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It was a pleasure to be here with you.
I hope you've enjoyed this very broad offering of topics. The book, Hermes Explains, has much more to offer that we couldn't cover in just one interview. For example, a few of the other essays that you can read are: what does popular fiction have to do with the occult? Religion can't be a joke, right? The kind of stuff that Madonna talks about, that's not real Kabbalah, is it? If people believe in magic, isn't that just because they aren't educated? And surely born-again Christianity has nothing to do with occult stuff like alchemy. So I hope you'll consider giving this great book a read. And as always, links to people and things referenced in this interview will be provided in the podcast notes. Please check out my social media for extra information if you're interested. And thanks for listening.